Jason had always dreamed of visiting London, and when the opportunity finally arrived, he could barely contain his excitement. It was a city rich in history, famous landmarks, and of course the British royal family. He had seen countless pictures of Buckingham Palace and read about the iconic changing of the guard ceremony, but nothing could prepare him for the feeling of being there in person. For Jason, it was a moment he had been anticipating for a long time, but it was also a moment that would change his perspective entirely. On a bright, chilly morning, Jason stood in front of the grand Buckingham Palace, feeling the weight of history around him. The palace itself seemed to stand tall and proud, its grand gates and intricate details adding to the sense of awe. Tourists from all over the world were gathered, cameras in hand, eager to snap photos of the royal guards in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. Jason, however, wasn't just there to enjoy the ceremony. He had a plan. Jason had always been the type of person to push boundaries. He liked to test the limits, especially when it came to rules and traditions. The royal guards, with their famous stoicism and unflinching discipline, intrigued him. People from all walks of life came to watch them, but Jason wasn't content with simply admiring their presence. He wanted to get a reaction. As the guards began to march into position, Jason felt a surge of excitement. He stood tall, stretching to his full height, and decided that today he was going to be part of the action. There was a small crowd gathered in front of the gates, all of them staring in awe at the guards who were positioning themselves with military precision. The ceremony was about to begin, and Jason knew it was his moment. He wasn't sure exactly what he expected to happen, but he had a feeling he could get the guards to break their silence. With a mischievous grin on his face, he stepped closer to one of the guards who was standing stoically in place. The soldier didn't even acknowledge Jason's approach. To most people, this would have been a sign to keep their distance. But not for Jason. He stepped even closer, determined to see if he could get a rise out of the guard. Jason moved in just a little too close for comfort. Standing just a few feet away from the guard, he could see the man's expression was unchanging, as expected, but that didn't stop him. He raised his camera and began snapping pictures, each click of the shutter louder than the last. The sound of the camera seemed to echo, but the guard remained perfectly still, not even a blink in response. Jason chuckled to himself. They're just statues, he thought, convinced that the guards weren't real people but part of some living performance. A few tourists turned their heads to see what Jason was up to. They quickly grew curious, and some even began to giggle at his antics. Jason felt a rush of adrenaline. The more people looked at him, the bolder he became. He was getting attention, and that was exactly what he wanted. As he snapped more pictures, he took it a step further. He raised his arms and began waving them in front of the guard's face, hoping for some kind of reaction. He even jumped in front of the soldier and made exaggerated gestures, trying to make it look like a game. Jason was testing just how much he could push the boundaries of this famous British tradition. As the crowd continued to gather, Jason's behavior became more and more daring. He started taunting the guard, speaking to him in exaggerated tones, almost like he was trying to convince the guard to move or say something. What, no reaction? You're just going to stand there like that? Jason's words were directed at the guard, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears. However, the few tourists around him were starting to lose interest, sensing that the moment was growing uncomfortable. Still, Jason pressed on, feeling the rush of defiance. The more the guard remained silent, the more Jason felt challenged. He couldn't understand why someone would stand perfectly still for so long, without reacting to the constant attention. Wasn't this some kind of performance? Didn't he deserve a response for his efforts? Jason's curiosity grew stronger as he continued to tease the guard, inching closer with each passing minute. The guard's eyes remained forward, unfazed by the interruptions, and Jason couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. But what Jason didn't realize was that he wasn't the only one paying attention to the situation. A couple of meters away, a group of police officers who were there to monitor the crowd and maintain order had been observing his behavior. The officers were well trained, especially in areas like Buckingham Palace, where high-profile visits and sensitive security matters were constant. They knew the rules, and they knew when someone was testing them. At first, the officers didn't intervene. After all, people often got excited during the changing of the guard, and sometimes a little harmless teasing could go unnoticed. But as Jason got more reckless, one of the officers began to take notice. Jason wasn't aware of the police presence just yet, and he continued his antics, still trying to provoke the guard into breaking his disciplined silence. He stepped even closer, now just inches away from the guard, and began to mimic the guard's stiff posture, making exaggerated moves in the hope of getting a laugh from the crowd. He even shouted in mock seriousness, "All right, let's see how long you can keep this up, huh?" He was convinced that the guard was some kind of statue, just a part of the show, and he couldn't resist pushing the limits even further. But Jason's playful challenge was about to hit a wall. The moment he moved too close and made a particularly loud comment, something changed. The royal guard's gaze flickered for just a second, and that was when Jason noticed. He hadn't seen the soldier's eyes move before, but now they were fixed on him. Jason's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way the guard was looking at him now that made him realize he had pushed too far. He took a small step back, but it was already too late. The shift in the guard's stance was subtle, but enough for the trained officers nearby to recognize the warning signs. As Jason stood there, still caught up in the thrill of his challenge, he started to feel a growing tension in the air. He was about to discover that this wasn't a situation he could simply walk away from unscathed. The guards and officers of Buckingham Palace weren't there for entertainment, and they weren't about to let anyone disrespect their post. Jason had no idea that the next few moments would lead to something far beyond the playful game he thought he was playing. But for now he was still lost in his own sense of mischief, unaware that the calm and unshakable royal guard was about to make his move. Jason's mind raced with excitement. For a moment he thought he had gotten away with it, that the guard would remain unmoved, just as stoic as ever. He felt invincible, like he was playing a game where no one could touch him. As he continued to taunt the guard, a growing crowd started to gather around him. They stood, some in awe, others in curiosity, watching Jason's antics unfold. It felt like he was the center of attention. People began laughing at his boldness, which only encouraged him more. He continued to snap pictures, even getting closer with each click of the camera. He was convinced that the guard's lack of reaction was just a part of some performance, a game he could keep playing. Jason thought, what's the harm? It's all in good fun, right? The more the crowd reacted, the more daring he became. His confidence grew, and in his mind he was winning. He was the one who had figured out how to make the stoic royal guard flinch, however. What Jason didn't realize was that his behavior wasn't just pushing the boundaries of respect. It was stepping into dangerous territory. While he had been too focused on the guard's stone-like composure, he hadn't noticed the group of police officers who had been observing him from a distance. The officers, dressed in their typical dark blue uniforms, were spread across the area, keeping watch over the tourists and ensuring everything went smoothly. They had seen this kind of thing before, tourists who thought they could have a little fun by messing with the guards. At first, the officers kept their distance. They didn't want to make a scene. They were trained to handle situations like these calmly, knowing that most tourists would get bored and leave once the novelty of bothering the guard wore off. But Jason wasn't like the others. He wasn't simply taking photos or admiring the ceremony. His actions were becoming more deliberate, more disruptive. The crowd around him began to shift, some of them looking uncomfortable at the way Jason was behaving, while others seemed more entertained. One officer, a tall man with short-cropped hair, had been keeping a close eye on the situation from the moment Jason first approached the guard. He had seen how Jason had started to push the boundaries, stepping closer and closer to the guard, shouting and making exaggerated gestures. This wasn't just harmless fun anymore. The officer could tell that Jason wasn't going to stop until he crossed a line that he would soon regret. The officer exchanged a glance with a colleague, a younger woman with bright blonde hair tied back in a neat bun. Without a word, they both began to move toward the scene. As they got closer, the officer's eyes locked onto Jason, who was still oblivious to the growing tension. He had been so caught up in trying to provoke the guard that he failed to notice the shift in the atmosphere. The other tourists had started to murmur among themselves, sensing that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained completely still, his expression as blank as ever. His discipline was unshakable, and his focus was solely on his post. But the officer could tell that the guard was now becoming aware of the situation. The guard had subtly shifted his posture, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to show he was ready to take action if things got out of hand. Jason, still completely unaware of the officer's approach, decided to take things even further. He smirked at the guard and in a mocking tone shouted, "What's the matter? You can't even look at me?" He made a big show of raising his hands and waving them in front of the guard's face, trying to provoke some kind of response. But the guard did not flinch, not even an inch. To Jason, it only made him more determined. He felt like he was winning, like he was in control of the situation. But what Jason didn't know was that the officers had now surrounded him. The younger officer, who had been watching quietly, stepped forward. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "Excuse me, sir. You need to step back." Jason froze, his eyes widening slightly. He turned to look at the officer who had spoken. The tone in her voice made it clear that this was no longer a game. He tried to brush it off, grinning as if it were all still part of the fun. "Oh, come on. I'm just taking some pictures, no harm done," he said, waving his hand dismissively. The officer didn't respond with words, but instead gestured for Jason to step back. It was a clear signal, and Jason had no choice but to take a step back, but not without grumbling under his breath. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not by someone he thought was just a regular police officer. Jason didn't understand that this was part of their job, to ensure that nothing disrupted the ceremony or caused a security issue. The second officer, a taller man, now moved into Jason's line of sight. His presence was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his stance. "You're causing a disturbance," the man said, his voice steady. "If you don't stop, we'll have to ask you to leave the area." Jason's stomach sank, but he quickly tried to talk his way out of the situation. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, his voice rising slightly, trying to make his actions sound less serious than they were. "I was just having a bit of fun. No harm done, right?" But the officers weren't having it. They had seen tourists come and go, some far worse than Jason, testing limits in ways that could quickly turn into serious issues. The last thing they wanted was to escalate the situation, but they couldn't let someone walk all over the rules, especially when it involved the royal guards and the sanctity of such a historic ceremony. They were trained to handle things with discretion, but if necessary, they would take action. Jason, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to backpedal, but it was too late. He could see the officer's resolve. He could feel the atmosphere change, shifting from amusement to tension. His confidence began to falter, but it wasn't just the officers that made him nervous. It was the crowd. The same people who had once laughed and cheered for him now stared at him with disapproving eyes. He could hear the whispers behind him, the judgment in their voices. "He went too far," someone murmured. "He's going to get in trouble." For the first time, Jason began to question his actions. Maybe he had gone too far after all, but it was already too late to back out now. The officers were serious, and Jason could feel the weight of the moment. What had started as a harmless joke now felt like a huge mistake. As he stood there facing the officers, his earlier bravado disappeared. The smirk was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. He didn't know what to expect next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to end the way he had imagined it. As the officers closed in on Jason, the excitement that had once filled him began to drain away. For the first time since he had started messing with the royal guard, he felt a twinge of nervousness in his stomach. The officers' serious expressions were a sharp contrast to the lighthearted game he had been playing. This wasn't a situation where he could simply laugh it off and move on. He had crossed a line, and now he could feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on him. Jason stood there trying to play it cool, but his heart was racing. The officer who had spoken to him earlier, the young woman with the blonde hair, was watching him closely, waiting for him to step back from the guard. But Jason didn't immediately comply. He still didn't fully grasp the severity of what he had done. He thought maybe, just maybe, he could talk his way out of it. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound of his own chuckle felt empty, almost forced. "I wasn't really doing anything wrong," he said, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. "I was just trying to get a picture. It's harmless, right?" He was trying to convince the officer, but deep down he knew his words weren't as convincing as he hoped. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, gently guiding him back away from the guard. Jason froze at the touch. It wasn't rough, but it was authoritative enough to let him know that his carefree attitude wasn't going to cut it here. He looked at the officer, who was now standing directly in front of him. Her face was calm, But there was no mistaking the professionalism in her eyes. Jason could feel the moment shift in the air. The officer wasn't asking him to stop, she was telling him. And the way she stood there with her arms crossed and her gaze unyielding made it clear that he was no longer in control of the situation. "Sir, you're causing a disturbance," the officer said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We need you to step away from the Royal Guard now or we'll have to take further action." Jason opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His earlier bravado had vanished, leaving him feeling small and uncertain. He had pushed things too far, and now it seemed like there was no way out. The reality of the situation hit him hard. He wasn't dealing with some street performer or tourist attraction. He was in front of Buckingham Palace, a symbol of British history and royal authority. The Royal Guard, stoic and silent, was more than just a ceremonial figure. The guards were trained soldiers, part of a long-standing tradition of protecting the royal family and their residents. Jason had made a huge mistake, and there was no easy way to fix it. The young officer turned to her colleague, the tall man who had been standing by, watching the situation unfold. Without a word, the man stepped forward, his calm demeanor never wavering. His presence alone seemed to add an extra layer of seriousness to the scene. Jason's stomach twisted. The officers weren't just doing their job. They were sending a message that he had crossed a line. The taller officer addressed Jason, his voice low but clear. "You're being disruptive. This is a royal security matter, and we can't let things like this slide. If you don't cooperate, we will have to remove you from the area." Jason's mind raced. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and the thought of being kicked out of such a famous location, or worse, arrested, was something he couldn't bear. His hands started to sweat and his mind scrambled to come up with something to say, but all he could do was stare at the officers, unable to find the right words. As the minutes ticked by, Jason could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on him. They had all been watching him earlier, some with amusement, others with judgment, but now the mood had shifted. People were starting to whisper among themselves, and Jason couldn't help but hear a few voices calling him out. "That guy's gone too far," one woman said, her voice rising above the rest. "He's really messing up now." Jason glanced around, and for the first time, he noticed the looks of disapproval from the people who had been laughing at him earlier. They weren't laughing anymore. The fun had drained from the situation, and now Jason was the one on the receiving end of their judgment. He could feel their eyes on him, their silent criticisms weighing on him like a heavy blanket. The officers stood silently, their expressions still neutral but unyielding. They weren't here to engage in a debate with Jason. They were here to maintain order and ensure that the royal tradition was respected. Jason, realizing that there was no way to talk his way out of this, took a step back. His shoulders slumped as the full realization of what he had done set in. He had thought he could have a little fun, push the boundaries, and maybe get a reaction out of the guards. Instead, he had caused a scene, disrupted the ceremony, and now he was about to pay the price for it. "Look," Jason said, his voice a little quieter now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I thought it was just a bit of fun. I didn't realize—" His words trailed off as he struggled to explain himself. But the officers weren't interested in apologies. They had a job to do. The younger officer nodded to her colleague, who stepped forward and motioned for Jason to follow him. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said, his tone not harsh but firm. Jason's heart sank as he realized the seriousness of the situation. He had hoped that the officers would simply tell him to leave and move on, but this wasn't that simple. He had crossed a line, and now there were consequences to face. As they began walking away from the crowd, Jason tried to gather his thoughts. The humiliation was overwhelming, but he knew he had no one to blame but himself. His mind flashed to the moment when he had first started teasing the guard, when he thought he was just playing a harmless game. Now he could see how wrong he had been. The Royal Guard wasn't just a figurehead for tourists to gawk at. It was a symbol of British history and authority. And the officers weren't just there to keep the peace. They were there to protect that tradition and uphold the respect it deserved. Jason was escorted to a nearby police station, where the officers took his details and explained the seriousness of his actions. He was given a warning and a fine, but the most painful consequence was the public embarrassment. News of the incident quickly spread online, with photos and videos of Jason's antics circulating across social media. People mocked him, made jokes about his failed attempt to get a reaction, and shared memes about the guy who messed with the wrong guard. It was a humiliating experience, one that Jason would never forget. The officers had done their job, calmly and professionally, but Jason had learned the hard way that there were lines you simply don't cross. No matter how confident you feel, what had started as a bit of fun turned into a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life.